Hey, high school literacy leaders. This is DLC Foster Yankee, and I'd like to welcome you back to Curriculum Chats. In this video, I'll be discussing the third lesson and the third section of the Alexander Hamilton unit. Here are the goals, TEKS and ELPs for this lesson. Students are writing responses that demonstrate understanding of multiple texts, including comparing primary and secondary sources in the musical. They'll analyze how Miranda develops complex yet believable characters through the historical and cultural settings and events depicted in the musical, as well as Miranda's purpose and message within Hamilton. There are 4 texts for this lesson, including 2 excerpts from Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow, a letter to Alexander Hamilton from George Washington dated February 2nd, 1795, and also Hamilton the Revolution. Not too many tools for this lesson. Students will be using the comparison organizational frame, the mentor sentence journal, as well as the vocabulary journal. Right, our lesson overview states that we will continue to explore the question, how did Lin-Manuel Miranda interpret primary and secondary sources to portray Hamilton's relationships? We will read and analyze excerpts from Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow and a letter from George Washington to Alexander Hamilton. We will make connections between the sources and Miranda's interpretation of the relationship between Hamilton and Washington. So now we'll take a closer look at the 6 activities that make up Lesson 3. In Activity 1, students read the excerpt from Hamilton becomes Secretary of Treasury from Chernow's Alexander Hamilton, which describes Washington and Hamilton's relationship during Washington's presidency. Then they read a letter from Washington to Hamilton after Hamilton resigned as Secretary of Treasury. They annotate the text as they read, underlining sentences that help them understand Hamilton and Washington's relationship, as well as circling unfamiliar words. In addition, they write down the words and definitions in their vocabulary journals, and for each word, they identify the vocabulary strategy they use to determine its meaning. Then, students use their mentor sentence journal to identify sentences that stand out to them as interesting or that represent a strong example of a particular concept they have learned. They can use these sentences to build a writer's toolbox, wherein they have a number of techniques at their disposal to use when writing. The primary source is a letter from Washington to Hamilton after Hamilton resigns. In it, he expresses his respect for Hamilton. Suggested supports. Students have practiced reading Chernow's style of writing, so now it might be appropriate for them to read this text in small groups or with partners. In small groups, the teacher might have different roles assigned, such as reader, facilitator, note taker, and fact finder. With the archaic language of the letter, it might be beneficial to read the letter as a class, depending on the ability of the class. If students need additional support accessing the text, the teacher might utilize the prompts on the screen. Or I think I put the prompts on the screen. The teacher also might have English learners think about how the construction of a mentor sentence compares to the construction of sentences in their home language in order to build connections from one language to another. The remaining suggested supports are the same ones mentioned in every mentor sentence journal activity. In Activity 2, students work in small groups using the comparison organizational frame to compare Hamilton and Washington's relationship in the musical to the excerpt from Hamilton Becomes Secretary of the Treasury from Chernow's Alexander Hamilton, and the letter to Alexander Hamilton from George Washington dated February 2nd, 1795. They continue, adding to side B by summarizing what they know about the relationship seen in the excerpt. They might also add to the point of comparison columns as they find common details to compare across texts. Suggested supports. The teacher might decide to do this activity as a whole class for continued practice and guidance if students are struggling to use this tool. In Activity 3, students reread the lyrics to one last time before reading the excerpt from Hamilton Helps Washington Write His Farewell Address in Chernow's text. Next, they read the excerpt, underlining sentences that help them understand Hamilton and Washington's relationship, and circling unfamiliar words as they do so. Suggested supports are again to have students do the activity in small groups with their assigned roles, including reader, facilitator, note taker, and fact finder. The instructions on the screen are an additional support if the teacher decides to use those roles. For activity 4, students work in small groups and use the comparison organizational frame to compare Hamilton and Washington's relationship in the musical with the excerpt from Hamilton helps Washington write his farewell address from Ron Chernow's Alexander Hamilton. They continue adding to sides A, the musical, and B, primary, secondary source, by summarizing what they know about the relationship seen in the musical and excerpt. Suggested support would be to have students complete this activity in pairs. In activity 5, students share with the class what they have included on their comparison organizational frame so far, as well as what similarities and differences they are seeing. Then they discuss some of Washington's characteristics they saw in the previous reading. During the discussion, the class should be adding to the class T-chart of Washington's characteristics that they began in the previous lesson, which a reminder would make a great anchor chart to add to the classroom environment. In the final activity of this lesson, students complete the sections of the comparison organizational frame shown on the screen by using the information they added for sides A and B and thinking about the characteristics of George Washington the class wrote on the T-chart. It is also recommended that they take a picture of the class T-chart if they have the technology to do so. They should be prepared to discuss their comparisons during the next class. Those suggested supports, it's recommended that students take a picture of or have access to a copy of the class T-chart because they might need a copy in order to complete their homework if the teacher opts to assign this activity as homework. Right, so our cub is the same cub that we have for lesson 2, and it is students will know characteristics of George Washington based on Hamilton, an American Musical, and Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. They'll understand the similarities and differences in Miranda's and Chernow's depictions of Washington and be able to compare the relationship between Hamilton and Washington in the musical to secondary and primary sources using the comparison organizational frame. So that's a wrap for this video. I welcome your feedback and look forward to hearing from you either on Twitter, via email, or in the comments. While you're here, don't forget to subscribe so you never have to worry about missing a video. Thanks for watching.